quite a lot of effluent produced at that stage, which has to be processed and cleaned up. And also, don't kid yourself that barley is somehow sterile. There's lots of microorganisms, many of them are useful, that live on the surface of a barley kernel. And therefore, we do need to keep the plant nice and clean. Otherwise, we will have lots of these organisms growing underneath the metalwork on which the barley is resting. And therefore, there's lots of cleaning that needs to go on in between successive malting operations. Then we go on to the kiln, and that's a tremendously demanding stage in terms of heat input. So maltsters are very, very concerned about how they can save energy, and lots of attention to preserving heat at that stage. So malting is really a demanding process. It's not trivial. Jokingly, I tell my students, especially the ones who are studying viticulture and enology, that all they have to do is to tread a few grapes. If you try and tread barley, all you end up with is sore feet. It takes several days to actually produce malt. And then the malt has to be stored for about a month before you can use it. You cannot take malt straight off the kiln and stick it into a brew house. So we store it for a period of time. So when we go to the brew house, remembering that the brew house is likely to be a long way from the maltings, the malt houses will be close to where the barley is grown. The breweries are likely to be closer to the centres of population. That's why the breweries are located in big cities, primarily. First stage in the brew house is grist to the mill. You may have heard of the phrase, grist to the mill. And so the first thing we have to do is to grind up this cereal to produce smaller particles. If you just try and extract the whole grain, you're not going to get very far. You have to expose that starch. And so the malt is milled to produce primarily three components. The first is the hull, or the husk. And if you remember, we're trying to preserve that to form the filter bed. And then we produce very fine particles, which we'll call flour, and then somewhat coarser particles called grits. And these are the small particles that will be hydrated by water and extracted in the brew house. We are now going to add water. We'll probably add about 3 times more water than milled grist. And what we have now is basically an enzyme reactor. The starch-breaking enzymes that we have produced during malting, they are now going to break down the starch into sugars in this mashing process. And this is going to take about an hour. Now, I'll explain in a later class why the starch was able to survive several days of malting, but is able to be broken down in just an hour or less in the brew house. But that is what is happening. This mash, breaking down starch to produce sugars. And then we're going to have what is called a lautering process. The word lauter means to separate. Some people call it wort separation or wort filtration. And we're going to run the liquid, which is called wort, W-O-R-T, wort. We're going to run that off. That's the sugary solution. We're going to collect that, and we're going to leave behind the spent grains. The spent grains, if we're not careful, they will rapidly spoil. They'll turn to acid. And therefore we need to get them out of the brewery as fast as possible. The good thing is cows love them. And so they, in most parts of the world, these spent grains will be shipped rapidly to the nearest herd of cattle. The wort, meanwhile, is run into a vessel called a kettle, or a copper, because historically it was made out of copper. And here it's going to be boiled with hops. And this boiling process also is going to take about an hour. So the mashing took about an hour. The wort separation, the lautering, may have taken 2 or 3 hours. And now we're going to boil for an hour. And in this boiling, various things are going to happen. One of the things that's going to happen is we'll stop any enzymes from working now. And we're also going to extract the bitterness from those hops. And the liquid will be run off, and we have hopped wort. Now, hops are interesting plants. There only is one use for a hop, and that is really to make beer. People are looking for alternative uses, and some of the hop materials are actually going into preservative function in various industries. But the primary use by far for hops is to make beer. The Romans used to put them into green salads, but I really don't recommend that. And I've had aftershave lotion made out of hops, but my wife threw it away pretty quickly. And you can put hops into a pillow and sleep on it, and you're supposed to dream of the person you love. Try it. It may work. I recommend you simply make beer out of them. They're fascinating materials. Hops provide two components to beer. The first of these is the bitterness, and the second is aroma. And depending upon the hop variety, then you can provide more bitterness or more aroma. And we'll talk about this in detail in a later class. The wort now needs to be cooled, and so it's passed through a cooling device, and we're now going to inject yeast into this wort. Yeast, Saccharomyces, sugar yeast. And it's the yeast, of course, that will carry out that wonderful equation converting a molecule of sugar into 2 molecules of alcohol and 2 of carbon dioxide. We will also put in at this stage a little bit of oxygen. Now, of course, this equation, this production of alcohol and carbon dioxide, is so-called anaerobic fermentation. It doesn't need oxygen. But yeast does need a little bit of oxygen, and it's going to use it to make its membranes, the tissues that surround the cells. And if we don't give it enough oxygen, it won't be able to grow, and it won't be able to give us our beer. These fermenters these days can be huge. Fermenters containing thousands of barrels of beer. It's a very, very intense process, and very highly regulated and very carefully controlled. Coming out of the fermenter, the beer is not ready. We need to mature it. Different brewing companies have got different ideas about how long you should mature the beer. Some brewers try to get the beer out and into the customer as fast as possible. Their argument is it really doesn't make sense to have beer sitting around in tanks when you could be selling it and brewing some more. Others, however, are firmly convinced that the beer needs to be stored for weeks on end to mature it and produce the beer that they delight in. It's horses for courses, and everybody's opinion, of course, is right, and it's what's right for one company is what they should do. Then the beer will be stabilized downstream in various ways before going into a packaging operation. Now, beer, of course, can be put on into kegs. Beer can, of course, be put into bottles and cans. This is a very intensive process, and as I've said already, this is the most expensive stage in a brewing operation. Bottling lines can bottle these days at around 1,500 bottles per minute. Every one of those bottles needs to get exactly the right amount of beer, needs to have the right quality. The beer needs to have as little air or oxygen in it as possible, because that's what will make the beer go stale and make it go cloudy. And we need to do this with minimum stops in the process. Mighty machines whirling around are bottling the beer. Similar machines whirling around at 2,500 containers per minute are putting beer into cans. You can can beer even more quickly. It's a very similar process. Again, we want the beer to be of exactly the right quality, the right amount. We don't want to shortchange the customer, and we want to make sure there's a minimum amount of oxygen in that container. So packaging is very intense. So let me just reprise this process. We start with barley. We are going to malt that barley. We're going to steep it and germinate it and kiln it. And this is going to take several days. a week or more. Then we're going to store that malt for 4 weeks. We are going to mash it. We're going to grind the grist, and we are going to mix with water and mash for an hour. Collect the wort, and then we're going to boil with hops. We're going to cool, and we're going to ferment. Fermentation may be as low as 43 degrees Fahrenheit or 6 degrees Celsius for traditional lager-style products. It may be as high as 25 degrees Celsius, more than 70 degrees Fahrenheit, for ales. And that, of course, will make the fermentation much quicker because it's at a warmer temperature. The flavour will be different. The fermentation temperature is just one of the parameters that is controlled in the brewery. And then after up to 14 days of fermentation, we're going to store or mature. And we're going to take the beer to a temperature as low as 30 degrees Fahrenheit to stabilize the product. And this can be for a very short period of time, perhaps 1 or 2 days, or it could be as long as a month or more. And then stabilize, filter, and package in an operation which will take us less than a day. It's a complex process. It's a process which has been developed over a long time. It's a traditional process. As we shall see when in the next class we talk about history, the brewing process has evolved. But if you go back a few hundred years, you'll still recognize the basic shape of the brewing process. What has happened is that science and technology have improved so that now we can control the process and regulate the process and achieve consistently a product which will delight the consumer.
This ends Lecture 2. If you borrowed this course from a public library and would like your own copy of the course guide for future reference, call Recorded Books at 1-800-636-3399 and we'll send you a free copy. A shipping charge will apply. Brewmaster's Art, The History and Science of Beer Making, Lecture 3. The History of Brewing.
In this lecture, let's look at the history of brewing. And we need to go back 8,000 years to Sumeria, to the Fertile Crescent, what is modern-day Iraq. And that's where beer, by pure happenstance, was invented, discovered, whichever way you want to look at it. In those days, there was a nomadic existence, and people would wander around the countryside going from A to B, following goats and finding grass and whatever else for them to eat and feed on. And the shepherds or the goat herds will be carrying bags of raw barley, which, as I've already explained to you, is tough and hard and not very pleasant and not especially nutritious in that form because it's so indigestible. And they would eat this barley, and I guess it was quite a miserable existence. But then one day somebody inadvertently got this barley wet, and it started to sprout in the way in which I described in the last lecture. And when it sprouted, it got softer and easier to bite, and it tasted different. It tasted like, well, I guess it tasted like bean sprouts must taste, that sort of flavour. And they rather liked that better than the raw barley. But then somebody smart found that they could take this and grind it up and make it into a loaf and bake it. And it tasted even better then. It must have tasted like malted milk balls or something, perhaps without the chocolate. And then they found that if they crumbled it into a jar and soaked it in water and waited, then strange things happened. And the liquid developed a characteristic which, when they drank it, gave them a euphoric and warm and cozy feeling. And we now know, of course, what was happening was that wild yeasts in the jar were converting the sugars from the malted grain into alcohol. So they stopped wandering around the countryside going from A to B, and they put the tents in a circle while they grew the barley and while they sprouted the grain and then made the loaves of bread and crumbled them and waited for the wonderful liquid to develop in the jars. And those Tents became villages, and villages became towns, and towns became cities, and so we have the whole basis of modern static civilization, thanks to beer. I may exaggerate a little bit, of course, but there is some sound reasoning behind that, and many people do believe that beer and bread and wine are the basis of civilization because of the drive towards an agrarian, static lifestyle. Beer was also later big in ancient Egypt, and there they would bake those loaves, half-baked loaves mixed with water and crumbled, and forced through the bottom of a woven reed basket into a clay jar that was bigger than a man, and covered with pitch on the outside to make it airtight, and sealed with a plug of Nile mud. That was the basis of the brewing industry in those days, and the brewers were women. It was a woman's job, and for the greatest part of history, actually, brewing has been the role for the woman, and the word brewster means a lady brewer. Beer and bread became the most important items in the Egyptian diet. Well, you can throw in some onions as well. They enjoyed those. And it was a cashless society, so beer was used as a unit of exchange, and it played a serious role in religious belief and ritual practice. When you died and you went off to Hades and floated off in the boat, off would go with you offerings to the gods, and which would comprise beer. And these days, if you go to places like the British Museum, you can see wooden funerary models which depict women making that bread and with the jars and crumbling the bread into the jars to make the beer. Funerary models that were used as part of the celebration of somebody's passing to the afterlife. Brewing has been associated with legislation for many years. In the year 1800, before the current era, in the Code of Hammurabi, those overcharging the customers for their beer should be drowned, was the edict. And so people have been concerned about people not being shortchanged on their beer for very many years. The Nile dwellers, they wrote the word food as a loaf of bread and a pitcher of beer, so it was illustrative of the importance that beer had as an integral part of society. Now, the Egyptians passed on the brewing techniques to the Greeks and the Romans, but of course in ancient Greece and Rome it was wine that was the drink of the privileged classes. Beer was consumed by the rest, by the proletariat. And so I guess the first wine snobs were the ancient Greeks and Romans. But of course the grape producing a product which was more alcoholic and somewhat sweeter and probably easier to drink as well. Beer has always been a more demanding and, in my opinion, sophisticated drink because it is often more challenging to drink because of its more intense flavour. Pliny the Elder, who lived in the years 23 to 79 in the current era, spoke of Cerevisia in Gaul and Syria in Spain, and he is quoted as writing, "The whole world is addicted to drunkenness. The perverted ingenuity of man has given even to water the power of intoxicating where wine is not procurable. Western nations intoxicate themselves by means of moistened grain." And perhaps this is one of the first examples of the wine literature pontificating about the supposed superiority of that beverage. But he referred to Western nations, and sure, in the Western nations, of course, because the grapes were not as desirable for the production of wine, then sure, grain was the raw material of choice to make their alcoholic beverages. And so if we look to British roots, we talk about brewing by the ancient Britons. Quote, "The grain was steeped in water and made to germinate, by which its spirits were excited and set at liberty. It was then dried and ground, after which it was infused in a certain quantity of water, and being fermented it became a pleasant, warming, strengthening, and intoxicating beverage." So we can see there that the malting process I described in the last class, describing the activation of the process and the development of enzymes, here was talked about setting at liberty the spirits. The brewing process in Western civilization was closely associated with the church, and beer was being brewed in the monasteries very efficiently. The monks would apply symbols like X and 2X and 3X to explain the quality of the product and to talk about the strength and define the quality and strength of beer in those terms. William of Malmesbury, who lived 1090 to 1143 in the current era, wrote that drinking was a universal practice in which occupation they passed entire nights as well as days. When he said they, he's talking about the English. They consumed their whole substance in mean and despicable houses, unlike the Normans and the French, who in noble and splendid mansions lived with frugality. They were accustomed to drink till they were sick, and these latter qualities they imparted to their conquerors. So again, that's this snobbery associated with the drinking of wine as opposed to the drinking of beer. The monasteries, then, who were brewing the beer, they passed on their skills to those who were brewing in their own homes. And remember that by the Middle Ages, ale was the drink of choice for breakfast, dinner, and for supper. In those days, of course, tea and coffee hadn't arrived, so ale was the drink on the table for everybody, young and old. Now, out of this domestic brewing developed the forerunner of the brew pub. So the beer was being brewed in the back by the brewster, by the housewife or the alewife, and was being sold out in the front. And there were two main products from one mashing, or from two mashings rather. There were two main products from mashing. The first runnings, so they mashed with water the first time and ran off the first worts, the first strainings, and fermented those, they would produce the strong beer. And then the grain will be steeped a second time, mashed a second time. And of course now we have less sugar, so that when you ferment this, you produce less alcohol, and that was called small beer. And it was a small beer that was consumed by the younger people, by the children, because it was less potent. The brewing was in wooden vessels, except for the vessel in which you need to boil, and that was made out of copper, and that was an open vessel for boiling the wort. We talked earlier on about the first examples of legislation to control the strength of beer. In 1266, the Assize of Ale in the United Kingdom, or in England, developed the ale conner concept. Now, an ale conner was a man wearing leather trousers, leather pants, leather breeches. And it was his job to go to wherever the beer was being brewed and to take a tankard of the beer and pour it onto a wooden seat and sit in it. If there was any sugar left behind, then when he stood up again several minutes later, he would stick to the bench or chair. If, however, the beer had been properly fermented and the sugars had been converted into alcohol, then he would stand up easily and the liquid would just flow off. And presumably he would drink some of the same to satisfy himself that it was of the necessary quality. That was the job of an ale conner, and many people in the 21st century would dearly love to have that principle still around. People would know whether the beer was being brewed by the brewer or the brewster putting a pole outside the house with an attached bush or an ivy plant to show that the beer was ready for testing and hopefully ready for drinking. And later, this pole with its attached plant would become a metal hoop with something in it to name the pub. So you might have a boot swinging inside this metal hoop, and the pub would be called the Boot. There was only one pub that could be called the King's Head. But these things, of course, these days have emerged or developed to become pub signs throughout the length and breadth of the United Kingdom, and of course in other parts of the world as well. By the early 14th century, there was one brew pub for every 12 people in England. That is serious drinking. And as I've said, the beer was brewed by females, the brewsters or the alewives. A huckster, spelled H-U-K-S-T-E-R, was a woman who sold ale that was purchased from somebody else who was doing the brewer, and a manufacturing brewer, known as a common brewer. Women who sold wine were called hostesses. The word bride comes from the English bryd, which in turn derives from brew. And so this reflects the fact that a bride, the wedding ceremony, would be associated with the drinking of significant quantities of a brew specifically made for that particular occasion. There were groaning ales for women who were about to give birth, presumably beers that would somehow take their mind off the occasion. Still, in parts of the world, there are locations where the brewing of alcoholic beverages is very much women's work. Chicha, made by the Quechua Indians. The saying there is, men can't brew. Chicha made by men only makes gas in the belly. Beer is women's work. In the medieval times, the ale was flavoured with something called gruit. Beers in the United Kingdom at that stage were not spiced with hops. They were in fact flavoured with mixtures of herbs and plant life, things like rosemary and yarrow and coriander, bog myrtle, pine root, spruce, even tobacco. They were put in things like wormwood and gentian and strychnine to not so much spice the product as to prevent organisms from spoiling it. On mainland Europe at the time, or in the countries that are now modern mainland Europe, they were using hops. But in England that was called the wicked and pernicious weed. And the reason was this. To preserve beer in those days, or to preserve the ale, because the word ale in those days meant unhopped beer, you had to have a strong product, lots of alcohol, so that organisms would not spoil it. But hops have got an antimicrobial component. Hops are antiseptic, and therefore by putting hops in, it did not need to be as alcoholic. And so the beer or the ale could be thinned, and that's why it was called a wicked and pernicious weed. In fact, if we talk about the connection between beer and the church, it was St. Hildegard, the Benedictine nun, who showed that when hops are put into beer, they stop putrefaction and lend the beer longer durability. So again, beer associated with the church. So this antiseptic property was quoted by a guy called Henry Denham in 1576, who wrote that whereas you cannot make above 8 or 9 gallons of indifferent ale out of 1 bushel of malt, you may draw 18 or 20 gallons of very good beer. For if your ale may endure a fortnight, your beer shall continue a month, and what grace it yieldeth to the taste. And most part of our lunchromen do abhor and abandon ale as a loathsome drink. Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, that ale is, these days, very much hopped. In parts of the United States, in my opinion, excessively hopped, but the word ale in those days was used for unhopped beer. Henry VI wrote, both the malt and the hops must be perfect, sound, and sweet, the malt of good sound corn, to wit, of pure barley and wheat, not too dry, nor rotten, nor full of worms called weevils, and the hops neither rotten nor old. The beer may not leave the brewery for 8 days after brewing, when officials should test it to see that it is sufficiently boiled, contains enough hops, and isn't sweet. So there again, even a member of the royal family pontificating about what beer should be. So by 1688, more than 12 million barrels of beer were drunk in a year in Great Britain for a population of 5 million. 12 million barrels, population of 5 million. And even the infants who drank small beer scarcely ever drank water. And of course, we know why. Well, we know why now. They didn't know at the time there were bacteria and microorganisms in the water. But there were. And if they drank it, they got sick. But in producing the ale and the beer, it was boiled. The product was boiled halfway through, and this, of course, killed off these bacteria. And therefore, you were healthier if you drank the ale and the beer. At this time, brewing companies were starting to get bigger. Beer was starting to be exported. And as the waterways developed, the canal system through the British Isles, so beer was being exported overseas. Peter the Great in Russia was a great lover of ale from England. I think he was a great lover of other things as well. In 1751, William Hogarth came up with two prints, two lithographs, Beer Street and Gin Lane. And these are very famous illustrations of comparing the relative merits and demerits of these two drinks. Beer was associated with health, good living, prosperity. And if you look at the Beer Street lithograph, you will see people building buildings and painting pub signs and drinking large quantities of foaming beverage and lots of food and lots of happiness and lots of jollity. And the only thing in disrepair is the pawnbroker's shop, and the pawnbroker's sign is falling down. If, however, you look at Gin Lane, you see that the only successful entity is the pawnbroker. The buildings are falling down, the people are falling down, there are people in disrepair, there are sores on legs, and this is what happens if you drink beverages other than beer. In reality, gin was taxed to a much lesser extent than beer, and people were making gin in all sorts of dubious ways. And so beer, being protected by various statutes and laws about what could and couldn't happen, beer was the drink of healthfulness and moderation. And drink beer and thrive. Drink gin in those days and go to hell and debauchery. But people were drinking lots of beer. Benjamin Franklin made a study of the British printing industry, and he observed that they were taking a pint before breakfast, another with breakfast, a pint between breakfast and dinner. There's another pint at dinner time. There's a pint at 6 o'clock. The last one when they finished, and then presumably they went down to the pub to drink some pints for pleasure. A lot of drinking. And to satisfy this beer production, you needed big companies increasingly. And of course we had the Industrial Revolution. One of the main driving forces of the Industrial Revolution was the development of the steam engine. Now, different people were contributing to the development of this. Of course, the name James Watt is associated, also Richard Trevithick. But what it meant was a development of industry. What it meant was a development of large companies making large quantities of products in factories. No longer were people living at home and brewing their own beer. They were expecting to buy the beer from somebody else, from common brewers. And these grew and grew in size. And so in 1636, we had the Stag Brewery, which is soon to close down. The Stag Brewery is the oldest functioning brewery in the United Kingdom. Recently was acquired by InBev, Anheuser-Busch InBev, and they have decided through efficiency to close it. But a really historical site by the side of the River Thames. In 1742, Samuel Whitbread started his brewery. 1777, William Bass, a very famous name, and the Bass Red Triangle is the oldest registered trademark of any type anywhere in the world. And in 1759, Arthur Guinness established his operation in Ireland. So in 1810, there were 48,000 alehouses for 8 million people in Great Britain. Let me segue momentarily to talk about the definition of the strength of beer. I've already talked about alcohol by volume. Let me now talk about the concept of Plato, degrees Plato. 1 degree Plato is equivalent of 1% sugar. So if you have a wort that is 10 degrees Plato, then it's approximately 10% sugar. And if you ferment that 10 degree Plato wort, you will produce a beer of about 4% alcohol by volume. So remember that, 10 degrees Plato, 4% alcohol by volume. In 1843, Burton Ale in Burton-on-Trent, England, was anything between 19 and 30 degrees Plato. So the alcohol content for a 30 degrees Plato product must have been pretty sizable, well into 2 figures. The strength of wine, basically. The common ale was 18.25 degrees Plato. So beers were quite strong. Perhaps it's no wonder then that concerns developed about society and about productivity. And surprise, surprise, the development of temperance movements. Indeed, there were very strong voices, various stages, in the early 20th century about excessive drinking. And there were strong voices in the United Kingdom government, for example, in World War II, and they wanted a ban on alcohol to divert raw materials to food production. But then they did a calculation, and they found that if the beer supply was cut in half, and the barley saved was diverted to chickens, then the net benefit would have been 1 egg per month in the ration, and everybody would have been pretty miserable. Severe public discontent. The American servicemen, the GIs, were given a warning about drinking excessive amounts of beer because, quote, the usual British drink is beer, which is not an imitation of German beer, but ale. The British can hold it. Beer is now below peacetime strength, but can still make a man's tongue wag. Whereas the advice to the Canadian servicemen was, well, if you're in England, add salt to the beer to improve the foam. That's a walk through the history of brewing in the British Isles. But what about Germany? The Western brewing industry first became established in the regions of Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic, and Bavaria, southern Germany. There were brewers at the court of Charlemagne who, like Henry VI of England, insisted upon using only the best technology, the most wholesome technology, in the production of beer. And up to 500 monasteries at the time were brewing beer, especially the Benedictines. Now, it's a myth that lager-style products have always been the type beer of Germany. Indeed, until the 16th century, ale was the major beer type in Germany. Bottom fermentation, in other words, the production of lager-style beers, probably started in Bavarian monasteries and was first mentioned in the minutes of the Munich Town Council in 1420. And the main driving force for the production of this type of beer was an edict from Prince Maximilian I in 1533. And what he did was to ban brewing in summer. The problem with brewing beer in the summer months, in the days when there wasn't ready access to things like refrigeration, was that there was a greater risk of infection and a greater risk of problems. And the ales, of course, had been brewed in these warmer summer months. Now, the beer was obliged to be brewed in the winter months and then stored, the word store is to lager, until the subsequent fall when brewing was allowed to start again. So what they did was brew beers in the winter months, including a beer called Märzen for March. And this beer was consumed later through the summer, and the last of it was consumed in the celebration of the Oktoberfest. Remember that the word Oktoberfest, although it's got the word October in there, refers to a festival which is occurring in late September, for the brewing again in October. One other famous edict coming out of Germany was in 1516, in Bavaria. And that's when the Dukes Wilhelm IV and Ludwig X declared the Reinheitsgebot. And the reason they did it was that up to that point, brewers were using somewhat undesirable and dubious materials. And the edict said that you could only use malt, water, and hops. In those days, yeast had not been discovered. We'll find out about discovery of yeast a little later. The law survives to this day and is extended throughout Germany for domestic brews, again restricting the raw materials to malt, hops, yeast, and water. In fact, in the terms of the European Union, it is a restraint of trade, but still people in Germany really do like to drink their beer that is made in this way. I've concentrated on the development of the brewing industry in the British Isles and in Germany, because really those are the two basic styles of brewing these days, the English ales and the German lagers. And it's really from both of these nations that the brewing industry developed elsewhere. For example, later we will talk about the start of the brewing industry in the United States. First of all, it was based on the English technology, the ales, and then as immigration continued, there was a much greater shift towards Germanic brewing styles, and the basic American style was based on Germanic processes. If we consider the Czech brewing industry and we think of the great Pilsner beers, then as we shall see, they were founded on a yeast that came out of Germany. So wherever you look in the world, fundamentally you can consider that they were based on the ales from the British Isles or the lagers from Germany. If we think of the great Chinese beer, Tsingtao, that comes from an outpost of the German Empire. In just the same way as the British had Hong Kong, so the Germans had Tsingtao. And that is why that beer style is very much Germanic. So having dealt with the history of brewing, let's now turn to the raw materials that are important to the production of beers of excellence. In the next two classes, we will talk about barley and malt, and we'll talk about hops and water, where they come from, how they are selected, and the impact that they can have on the process.
This ends Lecture 3. Brewmaster's Art, the History and Science of Beer Making, Lecture 4. Raw Materials, Barley and Malt.
Let's look at the raw materials for making beer. Malt is the soul of beer. Hops, the spice of beer, and the water, the fountain on which they thrive. 90% of the beer in the world is made from malted barley as the main grist component. About 9% of the beer is based on wheat malt. Some excellent beers in the world made from wheat. Indeed, if I'm ever flying through Frankfurt Airport, that's the ultimate breakfast, a wheat beer and a white sausage. Sorghum also is used for some beers. It's historically been used quite a lot in Africa. There's a lot of interest now in the United States for making beers from malted sorghum, because people who suffer from celiac disease may not be able to drink beers based on barley or wheat, but they're perfectly able to drink beers made from sorghum. These three basic types of malt are the heart of most beers worldwide. But for many beers, especially those made from malted barley, there may also be some supporting adjuncts, which actually provide an alternative source of carbohydrate. It's very unusual for beer to contain less than 50% of a malt as the grist, but some beers do contain significant quantities of adjunct for reasons we'll look at later. So why barley? Why is barley the main cereal for making beer? Well, there's a historical component. And we talked about that in an earlier class, where the first beers were made purely by happenstance from barley and also from a primitive form of wheat called emmer. But barley contributes to beer character, so the flavour and the foam and the clarity of beer are very much related to the barley and the malt that's derived from it. But also, as I've already said, the husk or the hull is very important as a filter bed in the brewhouse. And so if you have the husk, the preserved husk, you have satisfactory filtration in the brewery. Now, when you harvest barley, it retains its husk. Other cereals don't necessarily retain that husk, and therefore they are not as easy to use in the brewhouse. Now, barley is part of the grass family. It's a grass. And we can divide the barley into two basic families. There is Hordeum vulgare, which is known as 6-row barley, and there is Hordeum disticon, which is so-called 2-row barley. And the 2-row or the 6-row refers to how many grains you have on the ear. If you look at the ear of a 2-row barley, then alternately, as you go along the axis of the ear, you find one grain coming off on one side and one on the other side. If you look at the ear end on a 6-row barley, then there is seemingly a ring of 6 grains. So 2-row is basically one grain on either side, but a 6-row there are more. And therefore there is more space for the grain to develop on a 2-row barley than on a 6-row barley. The individual corns or kernels can get bigger. That means they will contain more starch. That means there is more potential fermentable material for the brewer. And that is why, in most parts of the world, 2-row barley is preferred. 6-row barley does actually contain more protein, and therefore they will give more enzymes. So if you are going to use a lot of adjunct that does not contain its own enzymes but does contain a lot of starch, then the malt of choice would be a 6-row because it would pro rata provide more enzymes. Let me remind you again of the malting process. Let me remind you that barley contains the starchy endosperm, this honeycomb-like matrix of cells with a wall, and inside the wall is protein, and inside the protein, packed in, is starch in the form of granules. There are 3 major components in that starchy endosperm. There are the cell wall components, there is the protein, and there is the starch. And we wish to break them down. They are each broken down by separate batteries of enzymes. There's a set of enzymes that will break down the cell wall components. There is a set of enzymes that will break down the proteins. There's a set of enzymes that will break down the starch. The cell walls are primarily made of something called polysaccharide. That is polymeric, chain-like material made of individual sugar molecules, all joined together end on. I liken them to chains. The proteins consist of chains of something called amino acids. The starch also consists of chains of sugars. But the sugars in starch are linked together, joined together differently to those in the cell wall polysaccharides. And as I've said, you need different enzymes for each. And these enzymes are developed during the germination of barley. So simplistically put, 3 different types of chain, 3 different types of enzymes. I liken them to scissors. You can imagine scissors breaking paper chains, then you get the general idea. So in the malting process, we start by adding water. It enters into that little hole, through that little hole at the embryo end. The embryo gets wet and starts to produce hormones. The water continues through the starchy endosperm, and the hormones follow it, and they reach the alurone, and there they switch on enzyme synthesis, the enzymes that will break down the cell walls, and then the enzymes that will break down the protein, and then the enzymes that will break down, finally, the starch. And these enzymes will follow the water through the endosperm to the far end and break down those walls and break down that protein, and the sugars and the amino acids produced will migrate back to the embryo and allow it to grow. And then we will produce something called extract. Now, brewers use this word extract very widely, so we need to define what it is. When we have sprouted our grain and germinated our grain, remember the last stage is the drying process, the kilning. And that drying we do very gently to preserve the enzymes. That malt will go to the brewery and will be ground up or milled and extracted in hot water. And in that extraction process we will break down the starch to sugars. And also we will extract anything that's already become solubilized during the malting process. The liquid we obtain is called wort, so it's a sugary solution. And the way we measure its strength is by measuring its specific gravity. Now the specific gravity of a liquid is the weight of that liquid divided by its volume. So water has a specific gravity of 1. That's because 1 milliliter of water weighs 1 gram. If, however, you have sugar dissolved in the water, then the weight per unit volume increases. So 1 milliliter of wort will weigh more than 1 milliliter of water. The specific gravity is the weight of the solution divided by the weight of the water. Okay, so it's the comparison of the specific gravity of the water and the specific gravity of the sugar solution. And we call this the extract. The higher is that specific gravity, the higher is the extract. And traditionally, of course, it's measured using a hydrometer or a saccharometer, which is a device which is floated in the wort and it's graduated, so it's the little lines which indicate the sugar strength. And the lower it floats, the lower is the specific gravity. And this is how we measure the strength of the wort, and this is how we follow the disappearance of the sugars during fermentation. The major producing states for barley in the United States are North Dakota, Montana, and Idaho. And of course, a lot of the barley that is used as malt in the United States also comes from Canada. So what constitutes a good barley for malting and brewing? The first of these is that it needs to have relatively low content of protein. It must contain some protein because the enzymes are proteins. And if you don't have any protein, you won't have any enzymes, and we need those enzymes, as we've already said. But for a given size of barley grain, the more protein, the less starch. There's less room for the starch. So there is this inverse relationship between protein and starch. This restricts the amount of protein fertilizer or nitrogen fertilizer can be put onto the field. This restricts the yield for malting barley. If the farmer is growing malting barley, they cannot put too much fertilizer on the field, otherwise you will produce too much protein in the grain, less starch, less extract. Obviously, this means that the yield of malting barley for the farmer is less. And this is the reason why malting barley attracts a premium. This is why, in the production of malting barley, the farmer would expect to be paid more. It is somewhat risky, because at the end of the day, if the barley does not satisfy the maltster and the brewer, then it can only be sold as feed at a much lower price. And of course, much lower yield than they would have got if they'd grown some other crop in the field. So in development programs for new barley varieties for malting, one of the main focuses is barleys that do not accumulate a lot of protein, but will give you a high yield of grain. We also want barleys that are resistant to infection and infestation. Barley is susceptible to the growth of certain organisms. One of the most worrying is something called fusarium. Fusarium produces a small protein which causes beer to gush. If you've ever opened a bottle of beer, and when you take the top off, the beer shoots out of the bottle, then I like to say there are two possible explanations. One is your friend is an idiot, and he thought it was very funny to shake your beer. The solution to that is change the friend. A much worse explanation is the barley is infected with fusarium. And this small protein produced by the fusarium, a small protein called hydrophobin, is what induces gushing. Fusarium also produces something called vomitoxin, which, as the name suggests, is something we really do not want to have in our malt and beer. So barleys that are resistant to the growth of these sorts of organisms are very important. We want a high extract potential. It is slightly more complicated than saying we want more starch, because remember that starch is wrapped up inside protein and wrapped up inside cell walls. And some barleys have lots of starch, but for whatever reason, it's harder to break down their cell walls and protein. So we really are choosy. We want barleys that have the cell walls broken down easily and the protein broken down easily. And then we will have barleys as malts which will give us trouble-free processing. They will give us high yields in the brew house. They will do it within the time available, and they won't cause problems in the finished beer. So it's not any old barley. Brewers and maltsters are just as fastidious about their barleys as winemakers are about their grapes. It's got to be the right barley to make the best malt. And so we need ways to tell the good barleys from the inferior barleys. We need to be able to tell malting grade barleys from feed grade barleys. And there are two basic ways of doing this. One is that you can look at the barley grain and look at its physical characteristics and tell one variety from another. The wrinkliness of the husk. Some barleys are really rather wrinkly. Others are smoother. If you look at the awn, that's the whiskery-like appendage that is typical of barley. You can see it in the field, that sort of whisker coming off the grain. That can have different appearances. It may be smooth or it could be rough. If you look at the underside of a barley kernel, you'll see there's basically a channel in it called the ventral crease. And that can be quite narrow or it can be quite broad. And that is a characteristic of the barley variety. And if you pearl barley, you'll have heard of pearled barley, that is taking off the outer layers. You may have used it in soup. But if you pearl the barley, you take off the hull, then you expose the alurome. For most barley varieties, it's white, but for some, it's blue. And that again is a characteristic. Some people are really expert at doing this, looking at all these different barley varieties and telling one from another. Personally, I find it incredibly boring. It's much easier to do fingerprinting. And what you can do is extract the proteins or the DNA from the grain, and you can separate it by electrophoresis on gels. And you get patterns of bands of either protein or DNA fragments. And they are characteristic of the variety. It's just exactly the same thing as happens in forensic medicine. To solve a crime, and you're looking for who is the perpetrator of the crime, then you can analyze fragments of DNA. So it is with barley, only here the crime we're looking for is somebody mixing two barley varieties and trying to sell you a barley that isn't all that it seems. So barley is susceptible to threats, diseases like mildew and take-all and eye spot and rust, and I've mentioned fusarium. There are also a number of pests that will ruin the barley: aphids, leather jackets, nematodes, and birds and rabbits just love barley. So the first stage in the malt house is steeping. This is a critical stage. And what we're aiming to do is to get every one of those barley kernels taking up exactly the same amount of water. And we want it to be distributed evenly through the grain. Now, this is a very ambitious target. There is a Measurement in the world of barley